If there's one thing that's lacking in this world in probably the last 5 to 10 years, and it keeps getting worse, it's communication problems. And more specifically, there's two types. We're going to cover one in this video, and I'll film another video on the other communication issue, but we're either giving too much information and a lot of it is useless, or we're giving too little. And for this video, I want to talk about the too much information. So the mental model I want to talk about today is called Chekhov's Gun. And when I say communication, I mean reading, writing, or speaking. And before I walk you through this, I want to go through a principle called this: respect your reader and listener. If you're going to open your mouth and somebody is forced to listen to you, and I say forced because there's a choice, or they open one of your blog posts or articles or even a tweet or a book or a podcast, respect your reader and listener. And part of that respect, avoid irrelevant info. And with that, I want to introduce you to what's called Chekhov's Gun. This is incredibly important if you're writing, you're speaking, you're putting things down on paper, any sort of communication that comes from you and goes out to at least one other person. Chekhov's gun comes from a Russian playwright named Anton Chekhov. And in one of his works, he talks about, he has the phrase, if in your book or your play, you introduce a gun or a rifle hanging on the wall in the first act or the first chapter, that gun better go off in chapter 2 or 3. And what that means is, if you've given the reader, in this case, Chekhov was a writer, so if you've given the reader a detail that they have to read and process with all the other writing that you've given them, it better be relevant. So there's such a thing called a red herring, and you may have seen this in war or disinformation campaigns where somebody will throw something out there, but it really doesn't have anything to do with that. And that can be useful in wars and with spies, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about genuine communication from you out to somebody else. They're reading your stuff, they're listening to your stuff, they're hearing you speak. Respect your reader and your listener. So avoid irrelevant info. And I'm going to give you an example of this. I was at a business meeting the other day, and the conversation got into the political arena, which I like to avoid if possible, but I'm going to give you an example of Chekhov's gun. And the guy's telling the story. He says, yeah, so, I went to this meeting and we're driving down the street and there's this yellow Mustang, this new yellow Mustang. And then anyway, we're driving down the street. So he tells the rest of the story, but you know what we didn't hear anything more of? This. No other mention of the yellow Mustang. And so this may seem a bit extreme, but to me, that's disrespectful to the listener, and here's why. He introduced the yellow Mustang. So as a listener, I'm waiting for the point. Is this yellow Mustang part of the story? Is it a required detail? And in this case, it wasn't. It was a wasted piece of oxygen that we had to listen, a group of us had to listen to, and then we have to sift through. Even if the story was entertaining or important, all of us are wondering, what the hell was the point of the yellow Mustang? It doesn't have any relevance in the story. And so this goes back to Chekhov's gun. For that speaker, if they introduce the yellow Mustang, it better have a relevant point. Otherwise, you've wasted all our times and you confused us. And here's another point about words and communication. The more words you use, the less impact your words have. If you've ever seen some of those emails talking about brevity is beauty. If I got to read your stuff or listen to your stuff and I got to use brain power to process that. It better be important. There better be some detail, some meaning, what's in it for me. And you can call that selfish, but really we're all thinking it. And so irrelevant details like the yellow Mustang violate Chekhov's gun mental model. And what I want you, how does this relate to you? Well, next time you're on social media, if you're writing, you're speaking, or you're, especially when you're telling a story, before you tell the story, if you can even spend like 10 seconds just thinking about, are these details relevant? Are they relevant? Are they important? And if you introduce one of them, you got to come back and explain it. We don't know the yellow Mustang. And I'm going to give you an example of, if you introduce something and it is important, you need to explain it. Assume your listener or your reader or what have you doesn't know what you're talking about. And here's one of my pet peeves, which I want to relate back to Chekhov's gun. I am taking the train the other day, and I get in the train station, I get in a conversation with somebody, and they go off on politics again. And the first sentence out of their mouth was, well, I was reading this thing about, there's some bill in Congress having to do with inflation. And the person that was talking to me said, you know, they were saying that. And as soon as I hear this word, who's they? I don't know who that is. And I don't want to have to work my brain to figure out who that is. And it turns out that the they in this part was important, unlike the yellow Mustang. But the speaker never told me who they was. So I have to stop them in the second or third sentence and say, who's they? Who is this? And what's that mean to me? And so they happen to turn out to be, oh, it's the news, right? The news. And so my first question is, that's still vague. Which news? Because there's mainstream news, right? There's TV news, there's internet blogs, there's independent researchers. And so it turned out to be CBS. And they asked me, well, couldn't I just say the news? And I said, no, because each one of these news people has a bias. And as soon as you tell me which news organization it is, I'm instantly going to assign a credibility score to that. Because if they have a bad track record and you say they, and I find out it's a news organization, for whatever reason it doesn't have a good track record, I may start tuning out. Or I may say, maybe there's more to the story. And this goes back to Chekhov's gun. You've introduced they, right? And it's important, whoever's giving a fact or an opinion, to have some credibility, but I don't know who it is. If you just use the ubiquitous they, I don't know what you're talking about. And I don't want to have to work to know what you're talking about. So when you use these vague words but the person behind the vague word is an important detail, introduce that person at least once. Here's another example. There's a group of people sitting around gossiping, and this was a couple weeks ago, and I walk into an event and they say, hey Don, what's going on? And so, you know, they've acknowledged me. I'll walk up, say hi before I'm going to go get some food. And one of the people in the circle says, Jan died. That's the first words out of their mouth. Jan died. Now, first of all, I know a few Jans, but second of all, I was not in the conversation when that happened. So first words out of my mouth are, who's Jan? Right? And they're like, you know Jan. I'm like, no, I know a few Jans. So they said, oh, you know Jan from the meetup group. Okay, well now you've given me some detail. So the speaker, I know them a bit. I'm not good friends with them, but they made an assumption. It's easier if using Chekhov's gun. Now again, this was a vital detail to know who the Jan is. Jan was from the meetup group, which we're both a member of, okay? If they would have said, Don, Jan from our meetup group died, I instantly know who you're talking about. And so from then on, if they say she, I can reference back to, this is who they're talking about. But because they were vague, I have to go back and figure out who you're talking about. That's extra words. And this goes back to respect your reader and your listener. And I get passionate about this because wasting people's time when you open your mouth or put something on paper and they go back and they have to ask a bunch of questions. You know, here's a rule. You know your communication piece is tight when there's no questions about the context. There may be some questions about the details. Suppose I say, hey, Jan from the meetup group died, My next question may be, oh wow, well, how did she die? That's fine. You don't have to introduce that to me right away. I mean, that's a question I'd like to know. I mean, they could have told me, but it's not required. The first sentence gets out the critical points. Is there's Jan from our meetup group. Okay, I know who that is, and she died. Okay, that's the event. Now I can hit them with the questions. But the key here is there needs to be, if you've phrased your text and your language or your arguments right, there should be zero context questions. And I make this argument all the time, and I swear I get headaches from this sometimes. Some people, and I'm not going to name names in this video, but there are some people out there that just cannot get the context down. And I tell them, and here's something for you too to know if you're missing context. When you tell a story, or you write an email, or maybe you record a podcast or record a YouTube video, are you getting context questions? Because if you are, then you're either violating Chekhov's gun, or you're respecting Chekhov's gun, but you're not giving details about the vital pieces of the story. And I was going to make another video out of the vital pieces, but I'm going to introduce this concept now to kind of tease it and get you thinking. And that is this. Context, for context, it should be 5W 1H. That's the rule. 5W 1H. Some of you may have heard of this. Some of you may have forgotten it. Some of you, this may be the first time. 5W 1H is who, what, when, where, why, and how. Anytime you open your mouth, put something on paper, you're communicating something from you to one or more people, you better have all the 6 questions answered, because that covers all the context. I'll give you an example. Here's a perfect example to go back to this. They were saying that the inflation bill might not pass, right? There's the sentence. First, there's a violation of who's they, right? I don't know who they is. What, we know there's an inflation bill. Where is kind of assumed if inflation bill, if we're talking about politics, we know it's the federal government. How, we'll get into that. That sometimes that how doesn't have to be answered right away. And then obviously why. Inflation is a big argument on everybody's mind right now. It's a big political topic. So for the most part, those are answered. But the W, the who, I don't know who they is. What's that mean to me? That's vague, right? And so before you open your mouth or write, ask yourself, do I have the 5W1H if it's needed right away? Some of it may need to be introduced later, and that's fine. But an opening sentence, when you're communicating with somebody, or a title, or the first 30 seconds, you better get most of these. Because if you don't, your listener is either going to get frustrated or they're going to tune out, and you've lost them for good. And so this goes back to respect your reader or listener. This is not hard to do. And a lot of people get, they want to get lazy. Oh, they, and there was this car. Like, give me some details. Not irrelevant details, but this was irrelevant, right? Yellow Mustang. We never came back to that in the story. But this is relevant. I want to know the news organization, because that's going to affect the rest of the story for me. And so, to wrap this video up, Chekhov's gun, the summary is, if you're going to introduce a detail into a story, it better be vital later in the story. You better be able to come back to it. It must be relevant to another point that you're about to make, or relevant to wrap the story up, to make everything clear. And a nice way to do that is the 5W1H. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. Be able to answer those questions. And what's easier is, you may have those answers, but if you don't give that stuff up front, your reader's just going to ask you. They're just going to ask you, because if they're trying to process a story and it's not easy to follow, they're trying to calculate this on the fly. What does this mean to me? Who's involved? Where are we going? What's at stake? And if you don't answer those questions, you're disrespecting your listener or your reader. And so think about Chekhov's gun, introduce a detail, it better be important, and then the 5W1H, which we'll cover even in more detail in another video. I know I was passionate about this. I get a little frustrated with weak communication, but please hear me when I tell you, if you can get this down, you will have people following your writing, your reading, and everything. Why? Because they don't have to work. You've given it to them on a platter. This goes back to my other video, low friction. Is your reading or your writing or your talking low friction? Can I see the point and see the relevance in the first 30 seconds without having to do a bunch of mental acrobatics or ask questions? Think about it.